Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: fears are rising of a widened Middle East war and U.S. troops are in the firing line. Sri Lanka War Crimes Project faces critical year for accountability. Drones versus warships: how U.S. military hardware is combating Houthi attacks on maritime shipping. The rebirth of Russian spycraft. Why China is unlikely to join U.S.-led force against Houthi attacks in Red Sea. Fears are rising of a widened Middle East war and U.S. troops are in the firing line. CNN. There are growing concerns that the Gaza conflict could escalate into a wider regional conflict with severe consequences for the U.S. The U.S. military is increasingly under attack from Iran and its proxies, with incidents occurring throughout the region from the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea. However, the situation is particularly dangerous for U.S. personnel based in Iraq and Syria, who are within easy reach of Iran-affiliated militant groups. If the situation worsens and U.S. soldiers are killed or naval assets are seriously damaged, there will be pressure on the U.S. to become more involved in the region, something that the last three presidents have tried to avoid. The potential for disruption in the Red Sea, an important route for global energy and goods, is also causing concern. The threat to shipping has prompted some freight lines to reroute their journeys around Africa, rather than through the Suez Canal, which would be more expensive and time-consuming. The economic and military consequences of a broadened conflict would be significant, and the geopolitical trend of testing America's will and credibility is worrying for the U.S. as it heads into an election year. Sri Lanka War Crimes Project faces critical year for accountability. Nikkei Asia. An international project is collecting and preserving evidence of alleged war crimes in Sri Lanka, with a tribunal set for early 2024, according to Nikkei Asia. The project, called the Sri Lanka Accountability Project, SLAP, is gathering evidence to be used against those accused of war crimes in a future tribunal. The death toll from Sri Lanka's 30-year ethnic conflict is estimated to be around 100,000, with estimates of war-related enforced disappearances ranging from 16,000 to 60,000. The SLAP is seeking evidence that is credible and can stand in a court of law, according to Rucky Fernando, a human rights campaigner. The government of Sri Lanka opposes the project, stating that it infringes on its sovereignty. The UN Human Rights Council will hold sessions in March 2024, which are expected to test the government's arguments against the SLAP. Diplomatic sources say some Western governments may use the SLAP's findings to target those accused of war crimes by using the principle of universal jurisdiction. Drones versus warships: how U.S. military hardware is combating Houthi attacks on maritime shipping. CNN. U.S. warships in the Red Sea are grappling with an increasing number of weapons fired by Houthi forces in Yemen. On Tuesday alone, 17 drones and missiles were launched towards Israel, according to Yehia Sari, a spokesperson for the Houthi forces. Attacks by the Iran-backed Houthis have totaled at least 100, and U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has formed a coalition of at least 10 countries to focus on security in the area. The Red Sea is one of the most important maritime trade routes, and attacks have had a disruptive effect on international trade. The USS Laboon and USS Eisenhower used surface-to-air missiles, explosive shells and close-in weapons systems to intercept the 17 drones and missiles launched on Tuesday. The cost of the destruction of drones and missiles is a concern for the U.S. military as the unit cost of its interceptors is $2 million, compared to drones that can be produced and deployed for less than $100,000. The U.S. has not said exactly what weapons its ships are using against Houthi attacks, but analysts say a U.S. destroyer has a range of armament systems at its disposal, including explosive shells, surface-to-air missiles and close-in weapons systems. The rebirth of Russian spycraft. Foreign affairs. Russia's intelligence forces have regrouped and become more inventive since the start of the war in Ukraine, according to a report in Foreign Affairs. The article states that Russian intelligence activities are drawing on a range of foreign nationals, and include spying on the West, tracking arms shipments to Ukraine, and applying pressure on Russian exiles and opponents of the Putin regime who have fled abroad. The report suggests that Russia's foreign intelligence network is becoming a greater threat to the West than initially assumed. Why China is unlikely to join US-led force against Houthi attacks in Red Sea. South China Morning Post. China is unlikely to send naval forces to the Red Sea to combat Houthi militants, despite being invited by the US. Analysts suggest that China will not join the anti-piracy drive until its own vessels face security threats. Houthi militants, who are backed by Iran, have been attacking commercial vessels linked to Israel in the lower Red Sea since November. The Houthis' assaults have led to shipping companies suspending transits through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The U.S. has established a coalition of over 20 countries to protect commercial traffic in the Red Sea from Houthi attacks. China has been invited to join the coalition but has not responded directly. Analysts suggest that China is concerned that opposing the Houthis could be seen as a capitulation to U.S. interests and a humiliation of China. Beijing has consistently condemned Israel's actions in Gaza and the West Bank. The Red Sea route has seen a sharp jump in booking prices as a result of the Houthi attacks. Song Zhongping, a military commentator, suggests that China will only join the US-led coalition if its interests are threatened. Will rebuild Gaza, death, displacement and a mother's 2024 hope. Al Jazeera. According to the United Nations, over 500,000 people in Gaza have run out of food and are now at immediate risk of starvation. Deliveries of food, water and medicine were stopped at the start of the war, and although some aid has been allowed to enter via Rafah, only 10% of food needs are being met. Water comes on tap only once a week, and is sometimes too dirty to use. The combination of poor nutrition and dirty water has led to outbreaks of diarrhea, gastroenteritis, and skin infections. Doctors are also reporting cases of infectious dysentery, chickenpox, measles, and viral meningitis. Overcrowding and poor sanitary conditions have also caused a whole new set of health hazards. Furthermore, communication is extremely difficult as there is limited electricity and internet access. Despite the numerous difficulties, Rania Sakala and her family refused to leave Gaza. They fled their home in October, but they are determined to return and rebuild their lives. Live updates: Israel's forces raid a West Bank refugee camp as its military expands Gaza offensive. Associated Press. Israeli forces have reportedly killed at least 6 Palestinians in a raid on a refugee camp in the northern occupied West Bank. The raid took place in the Nur Shams refugee camp near the town of Tulkarem. The Israeli military has not yet commented on the incident. Violence has been escalating in the West Bank since the start of the Israel-Hamas war on October 7. At least 310 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since then, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. The ministry does not differentiate between civilian and combatant deaths. China warns military fans they could face prison for posting photos online. CNN. China's Ministry of State Security has warned military enthusiasts who post photos of New People's Liberation Army, PLA, equipment online that they risk endangering national security. The ministry said that the photos could disclose operational and technical details of China's military hardware, with aircraft carriers being a particular concern. The warning comes as tensions between China and the US rise and reflects the Chinese government's increasing focus on national security. The warning states that repeat offenders could face up to 7 years in prison. Hamas reports 241 deaths in Gaza inside 24 hours. BBC. The Israeli military has said that the conflict with Hamas will continue for many more months. This comes as the Israeli military operation continues in the Gaza Strip, with at least 241 people killed in the past 24 hours. The Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, has called the war a grave crime against his people and has accused Washington of prolonging the war by vetoing UN draft resolutions calling for a ceasefire. Israel has hit over 100 sites in the Gaza Strip and there are reports of ground operations in central Gaza. The Palestinian Health Ministry has said that at least 20,915 Palestinians have been killed in over 11 weeks of fighting. The world wants a respite for Gaza. Israel vows to keep fighting. Washington Post. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu suggested that the current level of violence will continue or even intensify. The few hospitals that are still functioning in Gaza are overwhelmed and in desperate need of supplies. The war has caused a contradiction between President Biden's desire to reduce civilian casualties and his support for Israel's campaign against Hamas. The United Nations Security Council has called for an extended humanitarian pause in Gaza to allow more aid into the area. Netanyahu does not believe the war will end until Israel has won. Washington has pressed for the Palestinian Authority to play a role in Gaza after the war, but Netanyahu has rejected this idea. The Israeli Defense Forces have launched an investigation into their latest strike on a residential block in Megazzi, which killed at least 80 people. The IDF reported that there has been intense ground combat and aerial bombardment in Gaza over the past few days. On Tuesday, it was announced that Israel had returned the bodies of 80 people it had held during the Gaza war, and the Hamas media office made claims that these bodies had been mutilated and organs had been stolen from them. Hello everyone, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world. Let's dive into today's news. First, we have growing concerns about the Gaza conflict escalating into a wider regional conflict, which could have severe consequences for the U.S. The U.S. military is increasingly under attack from Iran and its proxies in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq and Syria. If U.S. soldiers are killed or naval assets are damaged, there will be pressure on the U.S. to become more involved in the region, something that previous presidents have tried to avoid. This situation is not only worrying for the U.S. but also has significant economic and military consequences. Next, an international project called the Sri Lanka Accountability Project is collecting evidence of alleged war crimes in Sri Lanka. The project aims to hold those accused of war crimes accountable in a future tribunal. The government of Sri Lanka opposes the project, but some Western governments may use its findings to target those accused of war crimes using the principle of universal jurisdiction. This project is critical for seeking justice and accountability for the victims of Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict. Moving on, the U.S. warships in the Red Sea are facing increasing attacks from Houthi forces in Yemen. The Red Sea is an important maritime trade route, and these attacks have disrupted international trade. The U.S. has formed a coalition of countries to address this security threat, but the cost of intercepting drones and missiles is a concern for the U.S. military. Russia's intelligence forces have also become more inventive and pose a greater threat to the West than initially assumed, according to a report in Foreign Affairs. China, on the other hand, is unlikely to join the US-led force against Houthi attacks in the Red Sea due to its own strategic interests. In Gaza, the situation is dire, with over 500,000 people at immediate risk of starvation. Aid deliveries have been limited, and the lack of food, water, and medicine has led to outbreaks of diseases and health hazards. Despite the difficulties, some families, like Rania Sakala's, refuse to leave Gaza and are determined to rebuild their lives. In the West Bank, Israeli forces have reportedly killed at least 6 Palestinians in a raid on a refugee camp. Violence has been escalating in the region since the start of the Israel-Hamas war, with a high number of casualties reported. China has also warned military enthusiasts against posting photos of new PLA equipment online, citing national security risks. Repeat offenders could face up to 7 years in prison. Lastly, the Israeli military has stated that the conflict with Hamas will continue for many more months. The war has caused a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, with overwhelmed hospitals and a desperate need for supplies. The United Nations Security Council has called for a humanitarian pause to allow more aid into the area, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu believes the war will continue until Israel has won. That's all for today's news. It's clear that the situation in the Middle East is escalating, and the consequences are significant for both the region and the global community. It's important for the international community to work towards de-escalation and finding peaceful solutions to these conflicts. As always, I welcome your thoughts and questions. What are your thoughts on these recent developments? Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.